The pictures show Australian average household expenditure per week. Generally speaking, there is a great deal of weekly spending in Australia, and much of it is for non-essential items. Australians are clearly enamored of the prospect of spending cash on holidays.
Surprisingly, Australians allocate more money to taking care of animals, $11 per week, rather than taking care of their children, $9 per week.
Looking in more detail at the data, holidays are at the top of the Australian household weekly expenditure list, costing $52 per week on average. Meanwhile, in second place, Australians spend on average $32 to have meals in restaurants. Australians tend to be individualistic, which is reflected in their preference to purchase mobile phones and audiovisual equipment rather than buying books or newspapers.
The picture shows the Australian annual household spending on various items. Generally speaking, Australian households are clearly enamored of the prospect of having non-essential lifestyle, with 4 things: purchasing luxuries on cars, doing recreation, consuming alcohol and meat in the top 14 most desirable household expenditures.
Generally speaking, Australian households are clearly enamored of the prospect of having non-essential lifestyle, with 4 things: purchasing luxurious cars, doing recreation, consuming alcohol and meat, and the top 14 things that Australians spend money on.
The pictures show how much Australians spend money on general living costs annually.
In general, Australians spend more money on less important needs such as cosmetics, alcohol, and recreation than on important needs like books, healthy food, and health treatment.
Moreover, most Australians are clearly enamored of the prospect of using private cars more than public transportation.
Moving on to look in more detail at the data, $78.4 billion are spent by Australians every year on cars.
This is in first place in the poll, while in second place is the spending on recreation, which took $19 billion per year.
When it comes to drinking spending, Australians buy more alcohol than tea and coffee.
Every year, they spend $14.1 billion on alcohol, while only $1.1 billion on tea and coffee.
In Australia, beauty is highly valued by Australians compared to brains.
Spending on cosmetics is $8 billion per year, whereas the spending on books is equal to only a quarter of the cosmetics spending.
Moving on to look in more detail at the data, top of the list is cars, in which Australian households spend $78.4 billion annually. In second place, $19 billion is spent by Australians on recreation, while Australians spend only $10.3 billion per year on certain essential things such as education and medication.
The infographic shows certain weekly expenditure by Australian citizens at different stages of life. Generally speaking, both the age and the number of family members affect the amount of money spent on their weekly needs. The more the number of family members in a house, the more likely they spend their money.
Moving on to look in more detail at the data, couples with children aged above 14 years old have to spend $1,000 more than single people do, except for housing. Couples with infants have to spend $100 more than couples with 14 years old kids. The same is true for couples without children, who have to pay $35 higher than couples with young kids do.
In addition to this exception, Australians tend to consume more alcohol when they are a couple without children. This spending on alcohol continues to decrease by between $5 to $16 per week when they start having children. Surprisingly, a single person spends less than half of the amount that couples without kids do on alcohol.
The graph shows the average weekly spending of 8 states in Australia. Generally speaking, Australians spend less money on household furnishing and equipment, clothing, and footwear, while they spend more money on current housing, transport, and recreation. On average, ACT, or Australia's Chocolate Territory, has the highest weekly total living cost amongst all states' weekly living costs.
Next is New South Wales, which spends $1,265 a week, followed by Queensland, which spends $1,245 a week. $1,225 is the average weekly spending in Victoria. Finally, the lowest weekly spending is in Tasmania and Southern Australia, with total averages of $1,064 and $1,044 respectively. Moving on to look in more detail at the data, on average, Australians spend $223 on current housing. This is higher than the transport cost, which is only $193 every week. Surprisingly, Australians spend much more money on recreation than on household furnishing and equipment and clothing and footwear combined. They spend $161 on recreation, but only $59 on household furnishing and equipment and $44 on clothing and footwear.